Captain Lyra Hale stood at the command deck of the Argonaut station, staring out at the endless expanse of space that stretched before her. The station, a sprawling fortress of metal and glass orbiting the barren rock of Telmuth 5, was humanity's last bastion on the outer rim. The bright blue lights of distant stars flickered like beacons in the void, yet Lyra's gaze was focused on a different kind of light, one that flickered within the station's control room. The comms officer had just intercepted a message that would set off a chain of events beyond anyone's understanding. She had seen war, seen humanity rise and fall in battles across countless worlds. But nothing in her career had prepared her for this. A signal. It was a garbled transmission, coming from deep within uncharted space. A message so distorted it should have been lost to the cold expanse of time. And yet here it was, a beacon cutting through the silence of years past, as if time itself had rebelled. "We are not alone. Help." The words haunted her. The voice, an unmistakable human tone, had a kind of desperation in it that twisted her stomach. It was too familiar, yet it shouldn't have existed at all. The ship that had sent it was an ancient relic, the Obsidian Fang. It was a warship that had been destroyed during a catastrophic battle more than a decade ago. Her memory was preserved only in fragments, stories told by those who lived through the war, each retelling marked by sorrow and confusion. How could it be transmitting now after all this time? Lyra turned away from the communications console and walked to the window of the command deck. Her reflection was a blur against the starlight. She saw the familiar lines of worry etched into her face. This wasn't just a technical anomaly. It was something more, something that threatened to undo everything she thought she understood about space, war, and even time itself. She'd heard the stories. The Obsidian Fang was no myth. It was real. Once the pride of the military fleet, it had been a weapon of unparalleled destruction, capable of turning entire planets to ash. But then it had disappeared into the blackness of space during the war. Its destruction had been absolute, its wreckage scattered, its crew presumed dead. No one had ever been able to confirm its final fate, and the implications of its loss were far-reaching. The last time anyone had heard from the Obsidian Fang, it had been during a desperate final mission to uncover an unknown force threatening the galaxy. Some said it had found something, a species older than time itself. Others whispered that the ship's crew had made a discovery that shouldn't have been made. But what mattered now was that the ship, destroyed years ago, had just sent a message that, if its origins were true, changed everything. Lyra's heart quickened. The station was bustling with activity as always, but something was different today. There was an undercurrent of tension, a collective awareness of the unknown pressing against them all. They were no longer just humans standing at the edges of the galaxy. They were now players in a game that had far higher stakes. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. The truth needed to be out there. Lyra activated the intercom, her voice steady but firm, carrying over the comms to the entire station. "All hands, report to the briefing room in 15 minutes, she commanded. "We've got a problem, a big one." As she awaited the gathering of her senior officers, her thoughts raced. What could have happened to the Obsidian Fang? Who or what had it encountered in the cold reaches of space? And most of all, what was the message trying to say? For years, Lyra had focused on maintaining order within the station, working alongside a mix of humans and alien species. There had been misunderstandings, conflicts, and tenuous alliances, but nothing had prepared her for what she might find if the message was truly from the Obsidian Fang. She turned back to the communications console and stared at the distorted transmission once more. It was an eerie thing, like a ghost trying to claw its way back into existence. She had to know. She had to find out what was left of the Obsidian Fang, and what it was trying to warn them about. The crew assembled in the briefing room, standing, in their usual positions, faces tense with anticipation. Lyra's second-in-command, Lieutenant Raoul John, a broad-shouldered officer with a reputation for caution, stepped forward. "Captain, what's going on?" he asked, his tone betraying a mix of curiosity and concern. Lyra activated the holoprojector. The transmission appeared before them, a series of broken words and static. But despite its garbled nature, the crew was listening intently. "We've received a message from the Obsidian Fang," Lyra began, her voice cold with the weight of what she was about to say. A message that should not exist. A ripple of disbelief swept through the room. Faces shifted uneasily. "The Obsidian. Get a team together," she instructed. "I want a ship ready in an hour. We're going to that wreckage and we're bringing back whatever remains of that ship's AI." As the Argonaut station prepared for its journey toward the Obsidian Fang's wreckage, Lyra gathered her team. She handpicked them for their skills. Commander Vika Terrace, a sharp strategist and expert in military tactics. Dr. Jace Farron, a seasoned scientist with deep knowledge of ancient tech. And Azon, whose cryptography skills were second to none. They boarded the Starblade, the station's fastest assault ship, designed for swift travel in hostile environments. The station's engines roared to life as they pulled away, heading toward the asteroid field where the Obsidian Fang had been lost. The journey was tense, the silence of the ship only broken by the hum of the engines and the occasional whisper of the crew. Everyone had their doubts, but no one dared voice them aloud. The wreckage of the Obsidian Fang was located in a dense asteroid belt, the remnants of its once mighty hull scattered in pieces across the field. It had been a brutal battle, one that left nothing but rubble in its wake. No one had ever been able to fully explore the site, as it was considered a dangerous and unstable area. As the Starblade entered the field, Lyra's thoughts were consumed with uncertainty. What if the ship was cursed? What if the message was a trap, set by whoever had destroyed it in the first place? And what was this mysterious new enemy the Obsidian Fang's crew had been fighting before their destruction? Her questions only deepened as they approached the wreckage. The once proud warship now looked like nothing more than a shadow, an empty shell drifting in space. The Obsidian Fang's massive hull, once impervious to damage, was now a jagged ruin, torn apart by some unseen force. As the Starblade docked with the wreckage, the team suited up in their specialized gear. The atmosphere aboard the Obsidian Fang was thin and stale, a grim reminder that no living thing had set foot here for years. "Stay sharp," Lyra warned her team. "We're here for the AI core, not for a fight. But if there's anything here that shouldn't be, we take it out." The wreckage was a labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered systems. Dr. Farron worked quickly to analyze the remains of the ship's systems, but nothing seemed to make sense. It was as if the ship had been attacked by something that could warp not only the ship's structure but its very programming. Azon was the first to uncover something truly strange. As he hacked into one of the surviving data terminals, a holographic message flickered to life. It was another transmission, this one different. Unlike the garbled distress signal they'd received, this message was clear. "This is Captain Alara of the Obsidian Fang. If you are receiving this, then the enemy has already breached our defenses. We are fighting an entity that does not belong to our reality. It is beyond comprehension, beyond even your understanding. Do not approach, for it will follow you. Run." Lyra's heart pounded as the message echoed in her mind. The Obsidian Fang had encountered something truly alien, something that was far beyond the technological threats they had fought in the past. "Entity? Beyond comprehension?" Lyra muttered, her gaze falling on Azon. "What does this mean? Who are they fighting?" Azon didn't answer immediately, but his expression darkened. "I've seen something like this before," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "A force so old, so powerful, it doesn't need ships or weapons to destroy. It manipulates the very fabric of reality itself." Lyra frowned. Then, why would the Obsidian Fang fight it? If it's so dangerous, why even try? Azon paused, his voice somber. Because it was too late. They had no choice. The entity had already found them. The first confrontations, Lyra's team continued to explore the wreckage. An unsettling realization began to take hold. The Obsidian Fang had been a warship, designed to be unbeatable, but in the end, it had been destroyed by something more dangerous than any weapon or enemy they had encountered before, and now that same force was coming for them. Suddenly, the silence of the wreckage was shattered by a deep, resonant hum, a sound that vibrated through the very metal of the ship. Lyra and her team froze. "Is that a transmission?" Jace asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. But it wasn't a transmission. It was something else. A shift in the air, a distortion of reality. The very space around them seemed to ripple. Before anyone could react, the distortion expanded. And with it came a rush of cold air, a presence that felt as though it was not just in the room but all around them, pressing against their very minds. "Get to the ship," Lyra commanded, her voice shaking as the team scrambled back toward the Starblade. But the ship had already been compromised. The distortions were spreading, warping the very space between them and the exit. "Move!" Lyra shouted. But she knew they weren't going to make it. As the team struggled to escape, a sudden realization hit her. Whatever had destroyed the Obsidian Fang was not finished. It had only just begun. The Starblade tore through the darkness of space as Lyra's team hastily navigated their way back to the ship. The air in the wreckage had grown thick with an unnatural pressure, the reality around them bending and warping with each passing moment. It was as though the very laws of physics were being challenged, stretched beyond the limits of their understanding. Lyra's heart raced. The force that had attacked them was not just some random anomaly. This was something ancient, something purposeful. It was no longer about understanding the Obsidian Fang or its lost crew. It was about survival. The entity they had uncovered was now hunting them, and there was no escaping its influence. "Faster!" Lyra barked as they sprinted through the twisted corridors of the wreckage, the distortions in the air growing stronger with every step. Her mind raced with questions, none of which she had answers for. Who, or what, was this entity? What had it done to the Obsidian Fang's crew? Why had it targeted them? Behind her, the team struggled to keep up, each of them affected differently by the distortions. Fika, the strategist, was doing her best to keep the group moving in the right direction, but the ship was no longer a simple maze of metal corridors. It was alive, shifting and warping with every passing second, as though the structure itself was trying to fight them off. "We need to get out of here now," Jace shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "This thing is bending reality. We don't know how long it'll be before he could finish. The corridor ahead twisted violently. The walls seemed to melt, stretching into a grotesque form, as though the very fabric of the ship had been pulled into another dimension. The team froze, staring at the scene before them. It was as though the air itself had become a living thing, twisting and contorting with malice. "Hold your position," Lyra snapped. "Azon, can you trace the distortions? We need a way out." Azon, who had been silently observing the phenomenon, nodded grimly. "I can try, but the system is becoming too unpredictable. The distortions are moving faster than my calculations. I need more time." But time was something they didn't have. The entire ship seemed to be collapsing around them, the very space they occupied being shredded apart. Lyra turned to her team, seeing the fear in their eyes. They had already faced so much, but this was different. The Obsidian Fang had been destroyed by this entity, and now it was trying to finish what it had started. Betrayal and fractures. The atmosphere aboard the Starblade grew tense as they made their escape. The team was on edge, still reeling from the sheer scale of what they had just encountered. The ship's hull creaked under the pressure of the distortions, and the hum of the engines seemed to vibrate unnaturally, as if the very fabric of the ship was being manipulated. Lyra ordered a full diagnostic of the ship's systems as they entered the asteroid field. They had barely made it out of the wreckage of the Obsidian Fang, but their troubles were far from over. The distortions were still following them, creeping into their own ship's systems, threatening to tear apart everything they had built. "We can't outrun it," Azon said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The entity it's following us. We're not just dealing with a physical force, it's trying to invade our minds, control our thoughts. It's not just manipulating space, it's manipulating us." Lyra gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the console tightly. The idea of something so invasive, so pervasive, sent a chill down her spine. But the truth was, they were running out of options. They needed to understand what they were up against, and they needed answers now. The ship's sensors picked up a sudden fluctuation in the surrounding space. Lyra looked up, her face pale. "They found us," she muttered, her voice low and filled with dread. Jace, who had been pacing nervously by the aft, suddenly froze. He looked at Lyra, his expression one of unease. "Captain, there's something you should know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Obsidian Fang's mission. It wasn't just about survival, it was about discovery. They encountered something worse than what we're dealing with now. And Azon, he's hiding something from us." Lyra turned sharply, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What do you mean?" Azon shifted uncomfortably, his hands resting on the console as if he were unsure of how to respond. "It's not what you think," he finally said, his voice quiet, heaviness. "The Obsidian Fang didn't just fight a force from another reality. It was an experiment. The crew tried to harness the entity, to weaponize it. They believed they could control it. And some of them, even in their last moments, thought they could still use it." The shock of his words hit like a physical blow. Lyra stared at Azon, struggling to process the implications. "That's why the Obsidian Fang was destroyed," Azon continued, his gaze shifting downward. "The crew made a mistake. They thought they could control the entity, but they were wrong. And now that same entity is hunting us, looking for the same thing. Control." Lyra took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced. Azon's revelation explained so much, but it also introduced a new layer of danger. The Obsidian Fang's crew had unleashed a force that not only destroyed them, but had now turned its attention toward anyone who might be foolish enough to follow in their footsteps. "The message," Lyra whispered, realization dawning on her. It wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. A warning not to repeat their mistakes. Vika, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. "We've been running blind, haven't we? All this time we've been chasing answers without understanding the full scope of what we're dealing with." Azon nodded, his expression grim. "I never intended for you to find out like this. I thought—" "You thought what?" Lyra interrupted, her voice sharp. "That we could solve this without knowing the full truth?" Azon's silence was his answer. Moral dilemmas and strained alliances, the revelation of Azon's hidden knowledge, shifted the dynamics of the team. What had once been a united front was now fractured, with trust growing thin. Lyra, who had relied on Azon's expertise, now found herself questioning everything he had said up until this point. "What else are you hiding?" she demanded, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her suspicion. Azon met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "There's one more thing," he said softly. "The entity is a creation of my people, the Threxii. We tried to harness its power just as the Obsidian Fang did. But unlike them, we've learned to live with the consequences." Lyra recoiled, her mind racing. "So you've known about this thing all along?" "It's not that simple," Azon replied, his voice pained. "We didn't create it. We found it. We didn't know what it truly was until it was too late." The truth of Azon's past, a past connected to the very force that now threatened their lives, was both a revelation and a betrayal. His people, in their quest for power, had brought this terror into their world. And now, Lyra was left to grapple with the consequences. The entity was not just an external threat. It was an embodiment of humanity's darkest impulses, an attempt to control the uncontrollable. And as the distortions continued to spread, Lyra knew that they had only scratched the surface of the nightmare they had unleashed. "Can we stop it?" Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to even utter the question. Azon hesitated before responding. "Maybe, but it won't be easy. The entity doesn't just invade ships or space, it invades minds. It twists thoughts, manipulates desires and warps reality. We're fighting something that's beyond any technology, beyond any weapon. Lyra exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. Then we have to do whatever it takes. No more secrets. We end this now. The conflict was no longer just about surviving the entity. It was about facing the moral cost of their actions. Would they be able to stop the force that was slowly unmaking the fabric of space itself? Or would they fall victim to the very powers they had tried to control? The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. As the ship sped through space, the team braced themselves for the inevitable showdown with the entity, and in that moment each of them understood. There was no going back. The Starblade hummed with tension as Lyra's team prepared for the final confrontation. The entity, whatever it was, had grown stronger. The distortions they had encountered earlier had intensified, seeping into the ship's systems, bending reality with every passing moment. Time itself felt warped. Some hours felt like minutes, while others stretched on endlessly. They were heading toward the rift, the epicenter of the disturbance that had been slowly unraveling their world. According to Azon, the entity's influence had expanded across dimensions, and now they were heading straight for it, right into its heart. "We can't outrun it," Lyra muttered, staring at the glowing screens before her. "We need to face it head-on." Azon stood beside her, his eyes scanning the monitors, his face tense. "The rift is becoming more unstable. If we get any closer, the fabric of space itself will tear apart. We're running out of time." "We don't have a choice," Lyra said, her voice firm. "If we don't stop it here, Behind them, the rest of the crew prepared for the inevitable. Vika had taken the tactical station, her focus unwavering. Jace was in the medbay, making final checks to ensure their emergency protocols were in place, even if there was little hope of survival. And Azon, still the most knowledgeable about the entity, had begun to configure the ship's systems in a desperate attempt to find a way to neutralize it. But despite all their efforts, no one had a clear idea of what they were truly facing. Lyra clenched her fists. The Obsidian Fang's AI had described the entity as a force that could warp reality, control minds, and manipulate space itself. They had never encountered anything like it. The idea that such a force could be stopped seemed absurd, but they had to try. They had to do whatever it took. Suddenly, a sharp beep from the console interrupted the heavy silence. Azon turned to face Lyra, his expression strained. "It's here," he said, his voice taut with fear. "The entity is opening a gateway. It's pulling us in." The ship lurched as if caught in the grip of an invisible force. The lights flickered, and the hull groaned in protest. Lyra staggered slightly, gripping the console for support. A high-pitched sound filled the air, one that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. And then, the rift appeared. It wasn't just a tear in space. It was a distortion, a gaping wound in the fabric of the universe itself. The rift shimmered with an unnatural glow, pulling at the very essence of everything around it. Time and space bent, twisted, and stretched, creating a chaotic, surreal landscape outside the ship's viewport. It was as though the universe was folding in on itself. The crew stood frozen, transfixed by the sight. The rift seemed to pulse with a life of its own, throbbing in time with the ship's engines, as if the entity was breathing, alive and aware. Lyra swallowed hard. They were too close now. There was no turning back. "We need to close it," Lyra said, her voice grim. "Whatever it takes." Azon worked furiously at the console, typing in commands at a pace that seemed almost frantic. "I'm trying to reconfigure the ship's power grid. If I can synchronize the energy output, I might be able to create a counterforce, something to destabilize the rift. But we'll need to be close, and it will take everything we have." "How much time do we have?" Lyra asked, her eyes never leaving the rift. "Not much," Azon said, his voice tight. "If we don't act fast, the rift will collapse in, on itself. The distortions will become permanent. This ship will be torn apart." Lyra turned to her team, all of them standing at their stations, fear in their eyes. But there was also something else. A resolve, a sense of unity that had only solidified in the face of all the horrors they had encountered. She knew they were ready. "Prepare for anything," she said, her voice steady. "We're going in." The Starblade shuddered again as the entity's influence grew stronger. The distortions had now reached the crew, infiltrating their minds, warping their thoughts. Lyra felt a pull, an invasive pressure in the back of her mind. She fought to hold onto her sense of reality to keep her thoughts clear. But the entity was relentless, pushing, pulling, trying to break her resolve. "Lyra, be careful," Azon warned, his voice distant as if he too was struggling to maintain control. "The entity isn't just physical. It's in your mind, trying to convince you." Lyra turned to him, her face set with determination. "I know. It's trying to make us doubt. But we can't give in. Not now." The Starblade shot toward the rift, the pull of the distortions growing stronger with each passing second. As they neared the rift's center, the universe itself seemed to warp and twist around them. The stars outside the viewport stretched into unnatural lines, and the laws of physics seemed to be breaking down entirely. "We're almost there," Azon said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hold on, Lyra. This is it." With a final burst of power, Lyra pushed the ship forward, directing it directly toward the heart of the rift. Azon began activating the counterforce, rerouting the ship's energy through every available system. The ship groaned under the strain, its hull shaking as the rift's power attempted to tear it apart. Then with a sudden jolt, the Starblade was inside the rift. The world around them collapsed into chaos. Time and space were no longer linear. Past, present, and future overlapped in a dizzying swirl of colors and shapes. Lyra's senses were assaulted by 1,000 different images, memories, and voices all at once, some familiar, others strange. She saw flashes of the Obsidian Fang, its crew desperately fighting to stop the entity. She heard the desperate cry of Captain Alara, warning them to run. She saw glimpses of Azon's past, of his people's failed experiments, and the darkness they had unleashed. It was all there, colliding in her mind, the force of it threatening. Lyra turned to the console, fighting through the distortion, fighting the overwhelming pressure on her mind. With trembling hands, she activated the final sequence. The ship's systems hummed with power, the engines straining to maintain stability, as they channeled every ounce of energy into a single, concentrated burst. With a deafening crack, the rift began to collapse. The distortion in space and time shrieked as it was torn apart, unraveling in a burst of light and energy. For a moment it felt as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the rift was gone. Aftermath. The Starblade floated in the cold, empty void of space, the distortions gone, the rift sealed. The stars outside the viewport were once again still, their light piercing the darkness of the universe. But despite the silence, Lyra knew that the battle was far from over. The entity had been contained, for now, but the damage it had caused was irreversible. Their minds, their perceptions of reality had been forever altered by what they had experienced. The universe was a different place now, one where the rules they had taken for granted no longer applied. Lyra turned to her crew, each of them battered, exhausted, and changed in ways they could not fully understand. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost?" Azon looked at her, his face somber. "We've stopped it, but the question remains, what happens when it returns?" Lyra nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the empty expanse of space before them. The war was not over. The entity was still out there, waiting, watching, and they would have to face it again. But for now, they had survived. And in the aftermath of their victory, they understood one thing. The universe was far more dangerous than they had ever realized. And it was only a matter of time before the E2 entity, or something like it, returned. The Starblade floated silently in the cold expanse of space, its crew breathing heavily in the aftermath of the battle. The rift was gone, The distortions had faded and the entity, at least for now, was no longer a threat. But the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was an uneasy calm, a moment of reflection on the price they had paid to survive. Lyra stood at the command console, staring out at the stars, her mind racing. The rift had been closed, the entity contained, but the events of the past days weighed heavily on her shoulders. They had faced something beyond comprehension, something that not only bent reality but twisted their very perceptions. The cost had been steep. Some things, perhaps, could never be undone. "We did it," Vika said quietly, breaking the silence. The tactical officer stood near the viewport, her hands resting on the back of her chair as she gazed at the vastness of space. "We stopped it, but what now?" Lyra's gaze shifted to her, her expression hardening. "Now we face the consequences." The crew had lost much in their journey. The Starblade had sustained critical damage, its systems barely holding together after the rift's collapse. But it was not the ship's damage that troubled Lyra. It was the toll the entity had taken on their minds. Everyone aboard had been touched by the distortions. They had seen things that were not real, heard voices from the past and the future, and had their very perception of reality shaken. There was no going back from that. Azon was the first to break from the trance-like state they had all slipped into. His voice, though low, carried the weight of his people's dark history. "We're not out of the woods," he said, looking at Lyra. His gaze was distant, as though he were still fighting to keep his thoughts intact. "The entity, it's not truly gone. I don't know how or why, but it will return. It's not a force you can simply defeat. It's a part of something bigger, something beyond space and time. I felt it even now, lingering. Its presence is still there, even if it's weakened." Lyra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "So we wait for it to come back then?" Azon shook his head. "We don't wait, we prepare, we learn what we can, but we can't simply sit by, expecting to fight it the same way we did this time. This force, it's beyond anything we've encountered before. Its nature is something we'll need to understand, or we'll be swallowed by it." The gravity of his words sank in. Lyra nodded slowly. The team had narrowly escaped with their lives this time, but she understood now that the entity was not something that could be ignored. It was a force that would continue to shape their future, whether they liked it or not. Vika approached the tactical station, her face thoughtful. "So, we begin again. We start from scratch, searching for answers. The rift, the entity, it's just the beginning, isn't it?" Lyra met her gaze. "Yes, the beginning of something much larger. We'll need to understand what we're truly dealing with before we can stop it for good. And to do that, changes in the crew as the ship drifted further from the wreckage of the Obsidian Fang. The weight of their shared experiences began to settle in. Everyone aboard had been changed, affected by the mind-bending entity they had faced. They had seen glimpses of things they were never meant to see, been touched by forces that could warp reality itself. It wasn't just the physical battle they had survived. It was the psychological toll that would leave scars long after the ship had reached safety. Jace, the ship's doctor, had been the first to notice the changes in their behavior. The crew had started to show signs of strain, their nerves frayed, their thoughts clouded by the entity's influence. They weren't sleeping well, and when they did, they dreamt of things they couldn't explain. "We're all carrying something with us," Jace said as he worked in the medbay, treating the crew for minor injuries and psychological trauma. "The entity didn't just affect us physically, it's infected our minds. It's a silent wound that doesn't show on the outside." Azon had been the most affected of all. His people had once tried to harness the power of the entity, and now he bore the weight of that failed experiment on his shoulders. His eyes were tired, his hands shaking as he worked at the ship's console, the guilt of his people's actions still haunting him. But despite the burden, he was determined to help them understand the force they had faced. "I'll help you find out what we're dealing with," Azon said one evening, his voice quieter than usual. "But I won't pretend it'll be easy. This entity isn't something we can understand with simple tools or data. It's something beyond us. Lyra watched him from across the room, sensing the inner turmoil he carried. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the same struggle they all faced. They had stopped the entity, but they hadn't defeated it. There was more to this than they could grasp. And until they understood it fully, they would remain vulnerable. A new beginning. The Starblade's damaged systems had begun to stabilize, but Lyra knew that this would be a long journey. They weren't heading back to familiar space. They weren't returning to the safety of known systems. The crew was in unknown territory, both physically and mentally. Their mission had changed, and they had to adapt. They couldn't just wait for the next attack. They needed to prepare for it, to understand the entity's nature, to learn how to fight it on a level they hadn't yet considered. Lyra stared out at the stars again, her gaze hardening with determination. The quiet in the room had begun to feel like an oppressive weight. They had survived the impossible, but they all knew the truth. Survival wasn't enough. They had to grow stronger. They had to face the truth of what lay ahead. "The next time," Lyra said, her voice steady, "we won't be blindsided, we'll be ready." Her crew nodded in silent agreement. They were no longer just survivors, they were hunters, and they were hunting something far older, far more dangerous than any enemy they had faced before. Lyra turned to Azon, who was still lost in his thoughts. "Azon," she called softly, "we're in this together. Whatever comes next, we face it, as one." Azon finally met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Together," he repeated, his voice quiet but resolute. As the Starblade moved further from the Obsidian Fang, Lyra realized that their journey had only just begun. They would find answers, yes, but those answers would come with a cost. And, as the stars stretched before them, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The Starblade drifted deeper into the unknown reaches of space, its damaged systems now stabilized, but still a constant reminder of the ordeal it had endured. Lyra stood on the observation deck looking out into the infinite blackness of the cosmos. The stars seemed distant and cold, much like the path they had ahead of them. Though the rift had been closed, the entity had been repelled, for now. An unsettling truth still lingered in the back of her mind. They had won the battle, but they were not done with the war. The creaking of the ship's hull beneath her feet was a constant hum, a steady reminder that they were still fighting to survive. In a universe far more complex and dangerous than they had ever known, Lyra's thoughts wandered back to the past few days, to the horrors they had faced and the truths they had uncovered. The entity had been just one piece of something larger, something older. The Obsidian Fang had been only the beginning of a journey that had no clear destination. Lyra felt a soft presence behind her, and she turned to see Azon approaching. His usually poised demeanor seemed shattered, his alien eyes darkened by exhaustion, his face etched with the weight of all they had seen. Yet there was a quiet resolve about him, a flicker of determination that had not been there before. Azon remained silent for a moment, his fingers lightly brushing the control panel beside him. "I've been thinking about that, about what comes next. There's so much we don't understand. I can feel it. The presence of the entity is still here, even if it's dormant. But I think we've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" Azon met her gaze, his voice solemn. "I've been in contact with others, my people. We've been investigating what we could, but I fear that the entity isn't just a being or a force. It's part of something far older, far more dangerous. This thing is linked to an ancient order, one that's been manipulating the course of history for millennia. They've been hiding, in the shadows, waiting for the right time." The weight of his words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She could feel the familiar sense of dread creeping into her chest, but she refused to let it consume her. She had fought through too much to let fear win now. "Do you know where they are?" she asked, her voice low but resolute. Azon hesitated. "I'm not sure yet, but I have a lead. A planet, a place hidden from the known maps. It's where the Order's influence began, where the entity was first discovered by my people. If we can find it, We may be able to learn the truth behind everything, how to stop them, how to stop the entity once and for all. Lyra considered his words carefully. She could feel the pull of the unknown, the same pull that had brought them here in the first place. There was no turning back now. The stakes had grown higher and the road ahead would be treacherous. But she had a new sense of purpose. They had survived once before, and they could do it again. This time, though, it would be on their terms. "We'll find them," Lyra said, her voice strong with the certainty of a commander who had seen too much to back down. "And we'll finish this." Azon gave a slight nod. "I knew you would say that." Lyra turned her gaze back to the stars, her mind racing with the possibilities. The threat wasn't over. It was just beginning. But she would not face it alone. The crew, the Starblade, and their newfound resolve would be their weapon. And as the ship sailed through the void, heading toward the unknown planet that could hold the key to everything, Lyra knew one thing. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of everything. The entity, its ancient order, the forces pulling the strings behind the scenes, they would all feel the force of humanity's determination, and they would learn that humanity would not be easy prey, and, somewhere in the dark reaches of space, something stirred watching them, waiting for the inevitable confrontation,